Welcome to this week's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. We are going to talk about cutting labels. What are they? What are they useful for? When do you include them? How to include them? Formatting tips, all the good stuff. So first of all, what the heck are cutting labels? You might have seen these in newer patterns. It's definitely a newer trend, but these things are super helpful. So cutting labels are literally just kind of little slips of paper that are included in the pattern that are meant for your reader to cut out and then kind of pin or clip to their stacks of fabric, either as they're cutting or after they've cut everything, to try and keep everything really super organized. And those are really useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps you keep track of everything. Again, if you've got something that's super complicated, you've got a lot of cuts, it can be a challenge. That can be the hardest part of the quilt pattern, in fact, is trying to keep track of all of the different pieces and knowing which one to use when and which fabric and all of that good stuff. It can become really challenging. So having cutting labels in there is just really helpful for that reason. But it's also really good as kind of a quick reference for the quantity and cuts that you need to be making as you're cutting your fabric. So when do you need to include them? Well, first of all, anytime you've got a quilt pattern that's got more than like 7 or so cuts, and this kind of goes hand in hand with labeling in your quilt pattern, and that's another video that I've done in the past that I will link here. Go check that out if you're interested. But assuming you're labeling all of your pieces, anytime you've got more than about 7 labels, it starts to get overwhelming for your reader to try and keep track of everything, keep everything organized. So once you've kind of crossed that limit, you want to be thinking about including cutting labels. It's also really important if you're cutting a bunch of things that are just kind of similar in size, but just one dimension is slightly different. So a really good example of this is like a log cabin block, right? You're cutting a bunch of strips that are usually the same width, and they vary in dimension by like 1 inch or half an inch or something like that, right? So you've got a bunch of really similar cuts that are just slightly different. That's going to be really important to use cutting labels with, because it's hard to keep track of all of those things because they're so similar. The last kind of use case is when you've got a bunch of the same cuts in a bunch of different fabrics. So you're making, this same 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle, but you're cutting it from 6 different fabrics and you're trying to keep track of that labeling because color placement's important. That's a really good use case to kind of include these cutting labels, because again, that just becomes overwhelming for a reader to try and keep track of unless they've got a way to label everything. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of different notions and things that you can get to kind of label these things. There's printout sheets that you can download off of like every other sewing blog that has these kind of generic labels to help keep track of everything, but there is a big benefit for including them in your pattern, ones that are kind of unique and tailored to your pattern. So that's what we're going to talk about today and why that's important. Some of the things that you would want to include to kind of set them apart from just kind of these generic labels and notions that are out there. So what are the things that you need to include on your cutting labels? Well, obviously the labels. It's kind of self-explanatory, because this is the link between the cutting table and the instructions and then the actual fabric pieces, right? We're trying to keep all of that consistent so it's linked and easy for your reader to just kind of grab the fabrics they need and proceed with the pattern. But other things you might want to include are things like the fabric type. Again, that's that quick reference. If you're making multiple of the same cuts out of different fabrics, or if you're just trying to remember what fabric goes with each label because you're not labeling A1, B1, C1, all of that good stuff, which again, there's pros and cons to that I talk about in that labeling video. But having the fabric type on there as a quick reference is super, super helpful most of the time. There's only a few cases where that's not important. Quantities are another thing you might want to include in these cutting labels, and those can be total quantities for the entire quilt pattern or block quantities. Now, total quantities, if you're doing a block-based quilt, will vary by size. And so, it's kind of up to you if you want to include that. I have seen patterns that include kind of multiple lines for each size of the pattern, and then you just kind of follow the line for the size that you're making. You can also have different sets of cutting labels for each different size. That gets a little bit excessive, so I don't necessarily recommend that, but it is an option. But if you're doing like a fat quarter pattern or a scrappy pattern where you're kind of making these sets of block pieces where you've got kind of 3 fabrics that have unique placement within the block, and then you're swapping them for the other blocks, it might make more sense to include block totals rather than kind of quilt pattern totals on those cutting labels, so that your reader knows when they're kind of trying to decide on fabrics, or if they're cutting as they go just to kind of keep everything nice and scrappy and random and just kind of following their heart, they know that they need to cut 4 of this piece from all the same fabrics and 2 of this piece from all the same fabrics, and so on. Dimensions are another one you might consider including. And again, there's pros and cons to this. If your cutting labels are going to be in a place that might be publicly accessible, so people have not paid for the pattern can get access to these things, maybe you don't want to include dimensions. That's totally fine because that kind of gives away some of the important information about the quilt pattern that they haven't paid for yet. But if these are kind of unique to your pattern and only people who've bought the pattern are going to have access to them, dimensions are a really helpful thing to include. And again, that's that quick reference so that you don't have to scroll back to the beginning of the pattern if you're in a digital pattern, or flip back to the beginning on a paper pattern and find that cutting table again when they're kind of in the middle of the project and they just need a quick reference for what size they're looking for. Unit labels are kind of the final thing that you might want to include. So if you have a bunch of subunits in your pattern and you're kind of labeling those intermediate units with something unique, just to refer back to later and make life easier, that's a great way to kind of simplify the pattern. But if you're making a bunch of those intermediate units, especially if you're making them in a bunch of different colorways, unit labels can be really helpful. So if, whatever you happen to be labeling those units as, if it's a flying geese and you've got like an AB flying geese and a BC flying geese, those kinds of things, you might include labels for those subunits in your cutting label kind of grid as well. That's really helpful because as you're churning out these intermediate units, it can be hard to keep track of them. And so allowing your reader to basically swap the cutting label for a unit label as they go to try and keep everything super organized can be really, really helpful. As far as like formatting for these things and actually generating the label, the easiest way to make them is to just insert a table in whatever software you happen to be using to write your pattern, whether that's InDesign or Canva. Just use the native table function and put a table in your pattern. And then within each cell, you're going to put the information that is going on this cutting label. And then that grid basically just goes typically at the end of a pattern in kind of all of the additional resource stuff. So it's usually like right before the coloring sheet and the appendix, maybe information about the cover quilt, kind of just this extra information at the end. That's usually where I see cutting labels included. Of course, it doesn't have to be there, but the benefit to that is that it's not part of the main pattern if your reader doesn't want to use them. If you're going to put them at the end, though, make sure you tell your reader about them at the beginning, because I've seen way too many people kind of get to the end of the pattern and realize they were cutting labels the whole entire time and be like, dang it, this would have made life so much easier. So if you're going to put them in the end, make sure you tell your user about them somewhere near the cutting table or then before you begin section. But at the end is totally fine. That's kind of standard. That's what I see most frequently. But basically, this is just a grid of labels, and your reader can just kind of print them out and cut along those black lines, the grids, and get all of their cutting labels ready to go at the beginning of the pattern. If you happen to be including these in a printed pattern, the best way to do this is actually to put it on the digital resources. Don't put them in your super pretty high gloss printed booklet. Nobody wants to cut into those pages anyways. So put them in the digital resources kind of link, and I will put that video here because that is super useful if you are doing printed patterns. But as far as formatting, kind of all of the basic formatting rules apply. The label is the most important here, so make it bigger, bolder, do something stylistically to it to make sure that it stands out, because that is the most important part. And then use, your italics, your boldface, font, all of those kind of stylistic elements, many of which we've talked about in these videos, to kind of make them easy to read and formatted in a way that is helpful to your reader. But sky's the limit here. Do whatever you want to kind of make them look like you, make them look like they're part of your pattern. The only thing that I would stay away from is color. And the reason for that is that these things are meant to get printed out. They have to get printed out on physical paper in order to be useful. And if your reader happens to be printing at a library or at a print shop, right, color copies cost more. There's really no need for these things to be colored anyways. So just stay away from color if you can. Make them black and white, make it easier on your reader so they can just print them in black and white and get a really quick, cheap copy shop copy in order to be able to start their quilt pattern. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe. And if you would do me such a big favor, tell a designer friend about this video series. That helps get all of this knowledge out there so we can all start writing better patterns. And selfishly, it helps me grow my reach and channel so that I can help serve more designers like you.